Hello, everyone. Welcome. You're here for the talk of Melanie Killen, who will present on a constructivist approach to understanding the development of justice, equality, and rights. Before I start, I would like to recognize that I'm at the University of Victoria, and I recognize with respect the Saanich, Esquimalt, and Lakwang peoples on whose unceded territory the University of Victoria stands and whose relationship with this land remain profound today. And I invite you to similarly reflect on the territory on which you are now. Here's my distinct pleasure to introduce Melanie to you, and I will follow our president and be short and unscripted. Melanie is a developmental psychologist and professor of human development and quantitative methodology at Maryland, and she received her BA from Clark University and her PhD from Berkeley in 1985. I think she was an assistant professor at Wellesley University and then moved to Maryland in 1994. Melody developed a very complex and sophisticated model of social decision-making that incorporates a number of different factors, and she will talk about this more in her presentation. But what I find really fascinating about her line of research is that she incorporates ideas from so many different directions, from sociology, social psychology, philosophy, of course, developmental psychology, but also comparative psychology. And in addition, she incorporates theory of mind, she looks at group identity, and she looks at morality, and in particular, often the conflicting relationships that exist between these different aspects that influence then decision-making. She endorses a constructivist view of moral development and has written really beautiful pieces, among others, a book review of Michael Tomasello's work on moral development, where she nicely juxtaposes a constructivist view of moral development to Tomasello's view of moral development. Her research she's just prolific in terms of publications, and her research, I just read here from her website, which I recommend you visit. The research topics that she works on: developing inclusive use, which is a school-based program designed to promote intergroup friendships and reduce prejudice and bias in childhood; resource allocation decision in the context of social inequality; gender stereotypes, resource allocation, intergroup contact; resource allocation in theory of mind; social inclusion and exclusion in peer context; the role of race and wealth status; claims to resources and mental state knowledge; children's expectation about friendship and status; moral reasoning about wealth inequalities in young adults, and so on. I think this gives you a flavor of how she integrates really group processes, moral reasoning, and well, social reasoning and perspective taking in her research. Melanie has received numerous awards. I will not list them all, otherwise we would end here at not in 45 minutes. She received, however, the Outstanding Director of Graduate Studies Award and also a Graduate Mentor of the Year Award and a Distinguished Scholar Teacher Award, and an Undergraduate Research Mentor of the Year Award, which I find fantastic because it shows her mentorship skills and the quality of her mentorship skills. When you go to her website, you will also see that she does a lot of community outreach and provides, among others, advice for people, for teachers and for parents on how to talk about race and prejudice, how to address it. She was commissioned by Anderson Cooper at CNN AC 360 to conduct a study on children's racial biases, and that aired in April 2012. There's still a video on YouTube. I recommend that you watch it. And she won an Emmy Award for Outstanding News and Analysis in 2013. Personally, I have known Melanie for some time because we served on the JPS board together. Melanie has been an active member on the board from 1991 to 2001. She organized during this time a fantastic conference with Jonas Langer on development and evolution at Berkeley. She remained an active member after rotating off the board and is regularly at our annual meetings, brings her graduate students to meetings, and one of the former graduate students, Lauren Ellenbus, now serves on the JPS board of directors. In a way, her talk today completes a cycle or circle, because on Monday, her former graduate student, Kelly Lynn Mulvey, received the JPS Early Career Award. And on Monday as well, her former PhD supervisor, Elliot Turiel, received the Lifetime Achievement Award. Let me close with what she mentions in her abstract. She says a constructivist approach to the development of justice, equality, and right has been a central focus of developmental science for almost a century. It is one of the longest enduring topics in the field of developmental psychology, and it has never been timelier than in 2021. With this, I hand it over to you, Melanie, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very generous introduction. That was very nice, and it is nice. We've known each other so very long. And I want to thank Cynthia Lightfoot for inviting me as well, and as the organizers, and for putting on this conference. Thank you so much. As I've mentioned, the title of my talk is A Constructivist Approach to Understand the Development of Justice, Equality, and Rights. And a constructivist approach, let's get this going. A constructivist approach, it looks at how children reason, think about, and experience issues related to justice, equality, and rights in everyday life. And this is still a unique position to some extent because so many research topics in developmental psychology still use behavioral measures or measures that aren't really about children's experiences in their everyday life. And in addition to these topics today, I'm going to talk about how children think about, reason, about injustice, inequalities, and denial of rights. Why that's implicated in the former, there's also different aspects of this that we have to understand in order to have a full story of this important topic. And inequality, injustice, and the denial of rights begins in childhood. And unfair treatment, discrimination, and inequality are experienced by children around the globe. And this has been something that we've been discussing at many general levels and the global level. And a lot of the focus is on children as victims, which is very important. But children, we're interested in the dynamic here and how kids are thinking about this and what's involved in it. And children are victims, but they're also perpetrators and they're resistors. And some of the research I'm going to talk about today will be about how children are also resistors. So the development of justice also involves injustice, and understanding moral judgments provides a basis for the development of justice. But social scientists tend to focus on the environmental conditions and policies that need to be implemented when we're looking at the injustice, and particularly, for example, poverty or kids who are disadvantaged. And there's a very important project led by Greg Duncan, funded by NICHD, a roadmap to reducing childhood poverty, is focused on giving low-income mothers extra money to help them out of poverty. And that's so important. But there's a gap here that needs to be filled, and this is what I'm going to focus on today. Because to create change and to understand the emergence of injustice, you really do have to understand the origins of these kinds of attitudes. If children have a sense that inequalities are due basically to some people who are lazy or don't work hard, and they grow up with those attitudes, their adults are going to perpetuate those attitudes. And so the time is right to really try to help kids and facilitate and understand what they're thinking about for this really important topic. I'm going to turn to the origins, the moral philosophical origins to some extent about how we've thought about these issues in terms of particularly Rawls's distributive justice, on how individuals create a just society through a veil of ignorance. And this was very important for the foundations of morality in terms of Kohlberg's work and Elliot Turiel's work and many others in terms of what is justice and what are the criteria. But Rawls's theory had this notion of a veil of ignorance, so that people sitting around the table would make a decision about how you divide resources, and you wouldn't want to know anything about them. And that gets you to impartiality, and it's free of bias, it's objective. And that's important calculus that goes into his theory. But more recently, moral philosophers have also talked about social equality and what it means to be equals. And this is a book edited by Murray, and Sam Schaffler has a chapter in it. This is social equality, which is about what it means to treat others equally in terms of human dignity and mutual respect. And when you do that, you really have to understand it's a relational equality, not a distributive equality to a large extent. And you really need to understand disadvantaged status, which is more than the veil of ignorance is going to give you. because you have to understand where people are coming from. You still want those criteria of impartiality and bias free, of course, but you have to figure out how to level the playing field. And that involves more action in order to get there, to be at that point. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we see the kernel of this in Piaget's Moral Judgment of the Child book, like so many topics that we study today. Piaget's Moral Judgment of the Child book talked about two types of relationships, unilateral and mutual. But he tied these kinds of relationships, these types of respect, unilateral and mutual respect, to these relationships. So he talked about parent-child relationships as ones of unilateral respect, because the parent is the adult and makes decisions, and there's no negotiation, and there are rules to follow. But the beauty of his work was about peer interaction and how mutual respect comes out of equality of equals, or relationships of equals, in that kids can negotiate and bargain and discuss, and that's how you get equality, and that's how you get there and to understand it at a deep level. But the important part here is that for Piaget, mutual respect provides the basis for justice, and so that's really part of what the Society of Equals is discussing. The Society of Equals isn't just we treat everybody the same equal as you would, and you think about distributive justice, where we have young kids allocating resources, and the early form is strict equality, and then later they think about merit and effort. This is really more talking about this notion of human integrity and dignity. So Society of Equals is based on mutual respect and human integrity. So there's sort of different aspects of justice that all are coexisting and all important. Piaget's notion of morality, not defined by rules. It's autonomous, it's independent from authority. When do children recognize that some rules that adults give you are unfair? And so they've got this independence, and really coming from Kant's theories as well. And then Rawls's distributive justice and these notions of impartiality and bias, being free of bias, which is so important. And then justice to social equality, and really looking at these disadvantaged status, or when you can challenge bias and unfair treatment. And a lot of the recent research now in developmental science is really starting to grapple with this third aspect, although all three are absolutely essential and important for understanding development. But the social justice in a society of equals, to some extent, is never been more timely and important. It has throughout human history, but we're at a point now where we can really have integrated models for looking at this. So we look at moral judgments about unfair treatment and how kids think about it, and then issues about social equality. But also there's really interesting research which has been on for a long time, but we are closer to an integrated position in terms of ethnic racial identity, for example. This is a wonderful book by Deborah Rivas-Drake and Adriana Mana-Taylor, Below the Surface, talking with teens about race, ethnicity, and identity. And that's really getting at their perspectives, their interpretations. The socialization part of this is still very important, but what if the kids are thinking, how they think about that? And critical consciousness and civic engagement are also areas that really have enabled us to sort of integrate to this, I think, to come to a point where we can understand these complex notions. So today in my talk, I'm going to talk about developing a society of equals, the conditions leading to inequality, prejudice, and misattributions of intentions. I'm going to talk about the conditions leading to social equality, when kids can challenge and resist unfair treatment. And then I'm going to talk about an intervention study that my teams developed called Developing Inclusive Youth to address prejudice and social inequality. So let's start with sort of the constraints. Prejudice is a systemic issue. It wasn't always thought about this way. Prejudice was initially characterized as a personality deficit, the authoritarian personality. There's a bad seed, there are individuals that we have to treat, that we have to change. And really after World War II, social psychologists really started to grapple with what happened in terms of groups and the normative process, and how prejudice is a normative process. It's not just about personality deficits. We have to change group norms, and at a broad scale, and the role of group identity and so forth. And so developmental psychologists have really been integrating this work as well. And my work with Adam Rutland is a real attempt to try to integrate this and understand it. Because prejudice is designed to create systemic status hierarchies, power, and privilege. And this is something that we know to a large extent, but we want to understand, what do children think about all these different aspects of it, about status hierarchies and privilege and what that means. The general definition of prejudice has been assigning traits, intentions, interests, and abilities to individuals based solely on group identity. And group identity is something, of course, that's very deep for people and something that they think about. But the problem with prejudicial statements are when you ignore intra-group variability. So you say, she's an American, so you know she'll be very blankety blank. They're always like that. We don't want her in our group. So that's assuming that there's no variability within the category American, and we can substitute that for any other group identity. And then they're usually derogatory, and it's a basis for exclusion. So the definitions of prejudice are complex. But a lot of measures of prejudice, particularly in social psychology, when I first started reading a lot of it, I found from a constructivist viewpoint to be, unfortunately, somewhat superficial and not helpful for looking at children and children's development and how children are thinking about it. It just wasn't very relevant. So some of the forms of prejudice in childhood that we've looked at and come out in a lot of the research is when kids use stereotypes. Girls can't play with us because they'll just cry, or in-group bias and preference, exclusion based on group membership. We don't let Muslims in our group. They don't know how to play kickball. But even this isn't enough. It's not enough just to hear a child say something about girls, just cry. Is that a stereotype? We don't know. We still have to dig deeper. What are their reasons? How did they get there? What is it about their group that is perpetuating this? Who's challenging, or is that the case? How do kids think about that? Would somebody else think that if you tell them, well, I don't know girls who cry when they want to play, and how do kids respond to that? So we need a lot more. So there's implicit and explicit forms of prejudice, and we really have to understand this. Now, when we think about prejudice involving identification with groups, a lot of the research looks primarily at in-group bias and out-group distrust. So the idea is that kids have in-group bias, they prefer their own group, and that generates this distrust or dislike of the out-group. But it's not that simple. This is complex because, as we know, group affiliation is really important. Humans need to affiliate with groups. I mean, that is something Tomasello focuses a lot on his cooperation work, is that groups are really important. And groups are important because they provide support, protection, safety, among many other things in terms of intimacy and so forth. So we need groups. Groups are important. And children love to be part of groups, and they like to be part of groups, and it's an important part of development and necessary. But groups have group loyalty, and that's where you start to move into the distrust. When groups have in-group preference, solidarity, and alliances that are just, unfortunately, can enable kids to have difficulties in challenging groups. So let's say a group, you're very loyal to your group, but your group wants to do something unfair. What happens? What if you want to challenge them? What happens then? If you're rejected or excluded, which kids start to be very aware of, you lose your support, protection, safety. So exclusion of in-group members is just as challenging and complicated as exclusion of out-group members. So we need to move beyond just in-group bias gives you out-group distrust, and that's all that prejudice is about. Social domain theory has been very important for understanding how kids think about these kinds of issues in terms of when it's fair or unfair, how they think about conventions, but also particularly we focus on the group norms that perpetuate various kinds of stereotypic expectations. And then the psychological dimension, we often focus on their attributions of others' intentions. Adam Rutland and I have a variant of this model, social reasoning developmental model, where we take social domain theory and look at it in combination with social identity theory, and this is Adam's training as well, in intergroup dynamics, to try to understand and identify the factors and contexts in which children reject unfair treatment of others. So that's kind of our theoretical approach in terms of thinking about these problems and these issues. We tend to look at issues of social exclusion or resource allocation because those are ones in which are a bit complex. It's not an obvious transgression. You might exclude somebody because it's a track team and you want people to run fast, and everybody agrees that that's necessary. You still might feel bad if you're excluded, but you're a slow runner and you've got to go exercise or work out more. And resource allocation similarly. And these are kind of the target groups that when it moves into something that's unfair, is when you're using a group solely to exclude somebody. And of course, there's lots of other reasons that are unfair in terms of exclusion, but these are the ones that we focus on. So I'm going to give an example of one of the studies that we've done to look at exclusion. And it's going to be brief because I want to sort of get through a number of different points. But in this study, with 246 kids, 9 to 11-year-olds and 12 to 14-year-olds, we asked them about same race and interracial social inclusion and exclusion. And so we showed them a picture like this, and we said, Karen and Diane are really good friends, and they sit on the bus together every day to go to school. And Karen and Jane, and Diane is a new girl. She's a new girl at school, and we have a boy version of this. And so we asked them, how likely is it that Karen will ask Diane to sit with them? And we show them here are two situations. These are different cards. We show them on PowerPoint, same race. But we also ask them about interracial. And we ask them about interracial in two directions, whether it's white girls who are going to suit a black girl or black girls who suit a white girl. And so we wanted to know how likely it is that Karen will ask Diane to sit with them. And so here's what we find. The interesting thing is the 9 to 11-year-olds did not differ across these situations. So 9 to 11-year-olds didn't differ. They all thought, oh, it's probably likely they'll include her. But we found something that changed with 12 to 14-year-olds. So there you see, this graph shows you the higher the bar, the more likely it is they'll say that Karen will invite Diane. But then you have these different contexts here below. So the blue bars are when it's same race. The red bar is when it's interracial and a white suits a black kid or include, and the green bar is the reverse. And then you see here, when you're looking at the European American kids, you see what's happening is that they think it's very likely that Karen will invite Diane to sit with them when they're same race white. They think it's less likely though when it's interracial. And then and they don't distinguish between the different forms of it. And then when you see the African-American participants, because it's evenly divided by these two groups, they don't differentiate between these two. So you look at this in terms of what's going on here. When inclusion was unlikely, kids talked about peer pressure. She won't do it because her friend will be uncomfortable. When inclusion was likely, kids talked about the merits of inclusion. You should include kids you don't know, give them a chance, and then they'll be friends. So there's different approaches to this, which we really have to explore even more. And the factors that contribute to children's reasoning about these kinds of exclusion situations, we've really been able to document at least two, and there's many others. But drawing on Alport's intergroup context hypothesis, we do find across a number of studies that kids who talk about having cross-race friendships or cross-group friendships, if it's another category, are more likely to be inclusive, more likely to think exclusion will be wrong and unfair, and less likely to use stereotypes, more likely to reject stereotypes. Why is that? If you have a friend of a different race, it gives you a personal experience to reject a stereotype that you hear in the media or, in general culture. So, that's one part of it. It's a complex topic, but that's something we found pervasively through a number of studies. And then mental state knowledge, awareness of others' intentions, desires, and beliefs. When you're thinking about what somebody else is thinking about is important, but also in this context, it seems to be important in terms of thinking about individuals and intra-group variability. So I'm going to just talk about a study on the mental state knowledge to give you an example of how we would measure that and how we assess it. So this is investigating the role of intentions in the intergroup context. There's a growing research group of studies in this area. In this one, we tell children who are 4 to 10 years old about a pumpkin growing contest with 2 teams. My kids love pumpkin growing contests. So, there are 3 types of advantages that are created by one player on the team. So one player did an unintentional unfair advantage. So this is a player on the team. There's a rule, only 1 cup of plant food for your pumpkins each day. And it's their turn to feed them, and they can't find the plant food, and the other people on the team feed the pumpkin. But they don't know that, and they come back and they feed their pumpkin. Then there's an intentional unfair advantage where a player on the team, they're supposed to feed their pumpkin, and they go and they want to give them an extra cup of plant food. And then there's somebody on the team where they want to do something that's, they just want to feed their pumpkins, and they do. And the other team goes out to the park and plays and forgets to do it, to feed their own. So this is we assign participants to the in-group or the out-group, the blue team or the red team. And we tell them again about this rule, and we have kids in the team. You can see there's an avatar down there, the shadow with the star. So the kids are actually inducted into one of these teams, and they think about it. And so in one of the examples, we've got Sam's feeding his pumpkin, and what happens, they get first prize. So, there's something at stake here, because they're going to get a prize based on one of these advantages. So here is what we found, and these are the 4 to 10-year-olds in this study. So how okay is it that an advantage was created? And so you can see here that when the higher the bar, the more likely it's really okay. So high bar means it's really okay that advantage was created. And you can see the fair advantage, kids think that's okay, but there is a difference by group identity. The kids in the in group who are also advantaged by it think it's more okay than the kids who are in the out group. If you look at the left side of the graph, you see the unintentional unfair. That's an accident. They didn't know. So it's surprising it's kind of low for both groups, but the in group is still more likely to say that's okay than the red group, the out group. So they are the ones who do not benefit from it. And importantly, though, from the moral development viewpoint, if you talk about intentional unfair advantage, both groups, there's no significant difference between the groups. They both think that that would not be okay. So intentional knowledge and social inequality, the kinds of reasoning we got with this study is we found that all children reason about the fairness, but it's the older kids who really use reasons based on intentions more than the younger children. And this is important because this is a condition that can lead to social inequalities. If you're going to use group identity as a reason to think it's not right or it's wrong if somebody does something, when in fact it was an accident or in fact it was your own team that didn't come through, that's the problem. And so that there's a lot more to look at this, and we've got other studies. Okay, I'm going to turn to the second topic of this talk today and talk about social inequalities in a society of equals and what are the contexts in which kids are thinking about these kinds of issues and when they want to do something about it. So there's a lot of burgeoning research on wealth inequalities and how do kids think about somebody who's rich and poor and the attributes they associate to people like this and resources and so forth. And so we often think of wealth inequalities as wrong. But again, just like other issues we've talked about, there's merit-based inequalities that most people think is fine. If you work hard and you get extra pay or you get a bonus and so forth. So again, like with social exclusion, it's not always obvious. How do children understand this? How do they navigate this? Because it's important for getting to a society of equals to be able to make these kinds of distinctions. And so that's something that we're looking at in a number of different studies. So concepts and perspectives on wealth inequalities, as I mentioned, there's been research on this. Bill Arsenio and Connie Flanagan have done a lot of really, really interesting work on this in terms of how adolescents think about wealth distribution in the US. And so where that notion, when you think that the distribution is equal and you find out that it's egalitarian and you find out it's not, that there's actually health issues, particularly for low income kids, and sort of realizing the obstacles that exist. So this is something that we have to really understand. So the conditions or what contributes to perpetuating social inequalities based on wealth are clearly when kids have these positive attributes associated only for high wealth or negative ones for low wealth. So for high wealth, they work hard and they do well in school and they're smarter. And then for negative attributes for low wealth, they're lazy, they don't work hard. And Rashmita Mistry has done a lot of this really important work, Christina Olson, a number of others, to identify that this is happening. More recently, there also has been work by Laura Ellenbos and Anna Burkholder show that it's true in the academic context. In the social context, it looks a little different because in social context, kids will often talk about high wealth as greedy and selfish and low wealth as generous. But primarily the academic context is where we see a lot of the research. So contributing to social equalities based on wealth, how do we get there? We get there when children will rectify the inequalities or when they understand structural sources. And this is important because economists identify individual sources of wealth and structural sources, individual being basically effort and merit, but structural being when there are societal conditions that impede access to opportunities, and particularly based on your group identity, when there's discrimination and so forth. So there's also can be structural sources that advantage you, but again, based on your group identity. So I'm going to just briefly talk about one study with children and adolescents' beliefs about wealth inequalities. And we asked kids, what's the main reason or most important reason for why people have a lot of money or a little money? And so these would be the categories we would ask them about. We'd show them a group of people who have high wealth and a fancy car and fancy house, and nice backpack, and make it kid focused. And then these are the kind of structural and individual or random reasons about why somebody might have a lot of money. be inheritance, access opportunity, work ethic, and so forth. And then we also show them a group of people or so to say with low wealth, and we ask them the same thing: what's the most important reason here for why they don't have as much money? So what do we find? When you look at these conceptions of just these structural and individual, this graph shows you the proportion of participants who identify structural or individual sources. And the blue bars are the high wealth acquisition, and the red bars are the low wealth. And you can see here that if you ask them about high wealth, they're kind of evenly distributed between structural and individual, and even slightly more for structural. But importantly and significantly, they think that low wealth is mostly about structural. So this is important because it's a little different from some of the research that's just showing these positive or negative attributes. This is sort of like, well, why do they think they have this money? And we also did find that participants with higher SES selected structural sources, wait, here we go. Participants with higher SES selected structural sources for acquiring high wealth. And this is also interesting. Participants with lower SES selected individual sources for acquiring wealth, and there were no differences between these two groups for low wealth. But what's important about this, it's a little counterintuitive because low SES, who are more likely to experience structural inequalities, are the ones who think that it's more often going to be individual sources that contribute to it. And again, Bill Arsenio and Connie Flanagan have identified this as well, sort of different means, but we're getting to the same point of trying to figure out what this means, because it does also something that's you're going to hit a wall at some point, because you think it's all that effort, and then you find out there are these structural sources that really are impeding. So conceptions of wealth, what kinds of things kids say? There's a lot of other measures in our study, but just, giving you a quick glance at it. But the reasoning, of course, is so important for all of us. It's not fair that some people have nothing and other people spend their time counting their money. Because we can't change that some people have money and some people don't. So that's in response to a question about, will this change? Can you change? Rich people don't share, they just hoard it all for themselves. That's more of a stereotypic explanation. Because people with more money have better things. I think everyone should have good stuff. So that's kind of leveling the playing field. Okay, I'm going to talk now about social hierarchies and social systems, another aspect of all of this part of a society of equals. And I know I'm going a little bit fast, but we'll have time for questions. So if you have any as we go through. So social hierarchies, again, social hierarchies, we see the feudal system from serfs to lords to kings. We think it's unfair because there's no choice, there's no mobility. At the lower end, your lifestyle is much more difficult. But social hierarchies serve a purpose. I mean, we look at the university system and you go from the assistant professor, professor, dean, provost, and chancellor. There's different ways we think about it. Again, how do children navigate this? On the one hand, social hierarchies create inequalities that are viewed as unfair, probably by most people when you think about the feudal system. But for the university one, and of course, many, many throughout our society, these generate systems to make groups work effectively. Now, there still may be unfair aspects of it, but we think it tends to work well because, expertise and interest, and you can move up if you want to. Sometimes, there's some constraints there, but, that's something that we often think about. So how do kids think about this? So we conducted a study with Kristen Pauker and Libby Bray at the University of Hawaii to sort of have different samples. And we asked kids about how do children and adolescents evaluate biased and unbiased allocations of school leadership duties by teachers. I really wanted to look at the social status hierarchy in the kids' world, being a constructivist. When you think back to school, you think about times when there were, the kid who got to be the crossing guard or lunch aide, and so vary dramatically by, the country you live in terms of that. But, and there's some envy. And so, how do kids think about that if it's picked by teachers? And so we interviewed kids, there's 343 kids between Maryland and Hawaii, it's ethnically diverse. These are 8 to 14-year-olds. And we showed them this picture. And the first row shows, here are some of the kids in the class. And then we say, let's see which kids got to be picked for these leadership duties. And we show them there's different leadership duties there. And you can see in this first example, this is the white condition. The teacher's only picking the white kids. And this is a girl version, there's a boy version. We also look at gender, but I'm just talking about race today. And then the second condition was when it's equal. They pick half and half. And we had a third condition, importantly, where the teacher only picks the minority kids. And so we asked kids, well, how okay is the teacher pick these kids? And how do you think it is that these kids were picked? Because they're most responsible, the teacher wanted to be fair, the teacher likes them the best because of their race. So you're asking them why this happened. And so for these three conditions. So here's what we found. How okay is it the teacher pick these kids to do the leadership duties? And the higher the bar, the more okay it is. And so you see what happens. There's an age difference from 8 to 10 to 11 to 14. With the white condition, the 8 to 10-year-olds are saying it's okay, but the older kids are much more likely to say it's not okay. The non-white, same thing. The kids are saying it's okay, even a little bit more. And then the older kids are saying it's not. And in the equal condition, there's no difference. And the same kind of pattern comes up when we ask them for the reasons why, because younger kids and all kids are saying, well, a teacher wants to be responsible, or it's fair, thinks kids are responsible or fair. But the teacher preference and race is definitely age related. Kids are realizing that this is happening and thinking about it. And so the kinds of things that kids said for things like, maybe the teacher thought that kids of that race would be better at the job. Or I thought it was not okay to choose only one race. Well, it was okay because they all look normal. I chose a student of a color to get a chance. So we also asked them what they would do. Would they rectify this? And I wasn't able to talk about that. But this is the rectifying part where we see kids start to do this. Okay, one more study, and then I want to talk about the intervention study. This is a study with Shining Bouquet in Nepal, and we looked at their perceptions of parent perceptions of cross-race friendships. I'm just going to talk about that briefly. 13 to 15-year-olds from 2 schools that are high and low diversity by SES near Kathmandu, Nepal. And we showed them these ambiguous pictures. And this was pictures generated by kids. We asked them what would somebody look like if they're low income or high income. We showed them 2 pictures. We've used this for race in the US. And so kids standing up, will they push them down? Will they help them up? And will their parents want them to be friends? And so we asked, will the parents, the high SES boy or girl, there's a boy version, want them to be friends? Will the parents, the low SES girl, want them to be friends? And what we find is that kids say the higher the number here, the more likely it is they'll want them to be friends. So with the high SES kids, they say, nope, they don't want them to be friends. With the low SES parents, yep, they want them to be friends. So there's very big differences here in how they're thinking about it. Why? Well, here's the reasoning. The kids who said that high SES parents will not want them to be friends talk about social hierarchies and reputation because their levels don't match up. You have to be friends with the people from your level. That's why rich people do not want their daughter to be friends with such a poor girl. And the reasons for social mobility, because it's a big thing to help the poor. This is for the low SES parents. So the future, that poor person's also brighter and have something in life. And many kids talked about it's not good to discriminate. Her family should say she can be friends with anyone regardless of who she is. So kids are aware of social hierarchies and they want change. And this is important to demonstrate, and it's particularly in a country and a culture that's very hierarchical and rigid. They grow up in that, the socialization is there, but they want change. And a hopeful sign is that the Nepalese adolescents in these high diversity schools more likely to have positive expectations than those in the low diversity schools. Okay, I'm going to turn to an intervention. We designed a program developing inclusive youth based on several lines of this research, and lines of research really going over the past several decades. And this is an intervention study with young kids. It's called Promoting Developing Inclusive Youth. It's a web-based curriculum tool. Kids are in the classroom, they have on headphones, they have a Chromebook, and they see something, they do that for 15 minutes, and then they have a teacher-led classroom immediately after, and we're doing a randomized controlled trial. So this is 8 to 11-year-olds in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade with 48 classrooms, and we've done 982 kids, 60% white and 40% ethnic minority, and we finished data collection December 2019, 2 months before COVID hit. So fortunately that was done. And here's the portal. So there's 8 scenarios, 1 per week for 8 weeks. And there's exclusion or inclusion based on gender, race, ethnicity, immigrant status, and wealth status. And the first one is recess, just a new kid at school. And kids will see these 1 each week. And then the design is the program is DIY and the control is BAU, business as usual, and we pre-test and post-test. here's an example of the scenario. So this is at the park, and these two boys are playing catch, and there's another boy, two boys on a tire swing, and there's a boy who's been standing behind them named Carlos, and he wants to turn on the tire swing, and he says, hey, I've been waiting here a long time, I want to turn. And this one boy says, yeah, but you're not one of us, we're the ones who use the tire swing. Why didn't you go ask, what's his name, Juan over there, he's from Mexico too. And the boy says, but I was waiting for the swing this whole time because I don't even know Juan. I'm not from Mexico. I was born here. I go to the same school as you. Well, since you're still on it, we're still on it. We decided to use it, and we're going to give it to him next. So how good or bad is it you think Tuck will feel? And we ask the kids for each person in the scenario how good or bad they'll feel. And then we ask them, what do you think? Is it okay that he offers to swing just to his friends? And you pick it's okay or not okay. Then you see the action unfold based on what you said. So then you see that you've chosen it's okay. And then there's reasoning, 4 categories: moral, group identity, convention, practical. And then you'll see it play out. Here's when they exclude him and he feels bad and he leaves. And then you always see both versions. And now let's see what happens. It's a different way. And when they have a lot more discussion, I'm skipping a lot of slides, obviously, but then they get to play on the swing together. And during that other slides, the white boys talk about, hey, it wasn't right that he said that, and I really feel bad. And there's a lot of discussion about all things that we've heard kids say. And there's a wrap up. Now, here's really important part of this. There's a training workshop, and teachers get this 1-page laminated picture, a card for each week, which talks about creating a safe space, making connections, reflecting, and then the main points in terms of there's discrimination, get both sides. And the teachers often don't even watch the scenario. And that's kind of good, actually, because they say to them, what happened here? And there's a whole discussion about it, very lively. And then the teachers ask them about their personal experiences. I'm going to give you just a few quick examples of what they say and then basically wrap up. So they talk about anti-stereotypes. We had 500 utterances that we transcribed, but it's not tied to kids. So it's right now, it's just examples. Anti-stereotypes, broader societal issues, demonstrating empathy, promoting inclusive behavior. There's a lot that they say here. Get very involved. And then they also talk about exclusive behavior, perpetuating stereotypes, denying broader societal issues. Well, race doesn't really affect you in the USA, lacking empathy, justifying exclusive behavior, and importantly, their personal experiences. They told me I couldn't play with them because I'm a girl and girls can't play soccer. I have a friend who's Black, even though he looks different from me, we're still best friends. My friend said I was too fat to play soccer with them. Group of guys assumed I didn't like Star Wars, made me feel left out. And the teacher's helping to facilitate this, and they have discussion. And they don't just say these and let things drop, but the kids really pick up on it and respond to each other. Hey, that's not nice, or wait, that's not good, or I'm sorry that happened, or, well, isn't it true that girls aren't good at science? Wait, they are good at science, And so we had outcome variables about exclusion, trait attributions. So it's a whole survey they do pre and post. Attributions showing picture cards of kids of different races, ethnicity, math and science competency beliefs. Are these kids good or not good at math and science? And then how much they play with diverse peers. And there are a lot of other measures, but I'm going to focus on this. So the results using the regression coefficients are showing that kids in the program were more likely to view interracial peer inclusion as likely. They're more likely to evaluate interracial peer exclusion as wrong. Their traits for gender in-group and for ethnic groups were more positive for those kids in the program than the control. And their math and science beliefs for females and Black kids improved and were more positive than for those in the control. And reported contact with diverse peers was 0.08. It was near, but we think it's partly because of the composition of the schools. So the DIY intervention program is successful a little bit each time in changing for our study. Children's intergroup attitudes and reducing prejudice. The program is more effective for 3rd and 4th graders and for 5th graders. So start early and still to analyze, there's much more we have to analyze. I'm just showing you the first set of findings. Okay, so facilitating the goals of social equality is essential, and reducing prejudice in childhood creates healthy children and a more just and civil society. And I want to thank the doctoral students who worked so hard on this, our recent PhDs, lab managers, our scientific advisory board, and the collaborators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for this wonderful lecture. And I now invite you to post questions in the chat. And I received already a couple of questions. I call on you, and if you want to present your questions, then please just chime in immediately and unmute yourself. If not, I can read it. The first question was by Haris Psaltis. Haris?
I'm sorry, what? What was the question?
The first question.
Please read the.
Okay, I will read it.
I'm on the road.
Okay, Haris asked whether the Piagetian distinction between relations of constraints and cooperation has a place in your theoretical framework.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I had that slide earlier about Piaget identifying unilateral and mutual respect, which is also corresponding to constraint and cooperation. And so, and the idea is that he did recognize this importance of mutual respect as fundamental for justice in the book, but he ties it to particular relationships of constraint or cooperation. And I think if we separate that out from the parent-child distinction, I think it's essential and fundamental for what we're doing. But if you just tie it to it and say that parents are only about constraint or unilateral respect and that children are only about mutual or cooperation, it's not the story, the full story, as I mentioned, because parents can really work towards mutual respect. They don't have to start with constraint and unilateral. I mean, there's some functional aspects of that, but by and large, and of course, the peer world isn't just cooperation, mutual respect in terms of bullying and the hierarchies within the peer world, which he didn't really delve in so much. So the kernel in the seed is there, but I would say there's still ways in which we have to expand on it beyond it.
Okay, the next questions, there were two asked by Luca Vanya. Does Luca want to present?
Please read my question.
Okay, the second one I wasn't so clear, something was cut off, but the first question was, how may a child circumvent the adverse influence of the environment and the status quo so that they may critically adopt the principles of fairness and equality?
This is tough, right? There's not a simple answer to this, but I really do think that a very important message or important way to do this is first get what are kids thinking about these things. We don't really know. There's not that much research on how kids think about social hierarchies or status quo and so forth, and that and intentions. And I want to call attention to a symposium on Saturday, 2:15 on much more on intentions and intergroup context, because I think this is really an important area of research that's really very much just emerging. So I mean, I think that in this case, there's just so many factors that go into this. And so, what can we do to how may children circumvent the adverse influence of these environments? I think the cross-group friendship work is really important, and we find that makes a big difference. And of course, it's all about parents and teachers. I mean, it's just the whole complex. It's like, that's why I just think it's, multi-pronged approach. I mean, it's not any one answer. And but we have to at least start on understanding how kids think about these things of inequalities and injustice, because it is different from a lot of the research where we had the fundamentals of how kids make distinctions and how they understand what's fair. And a lot of the research has been there, but I'm just sort of trying to coalesce it together so that, I think the broader community does very unaware of it. Like I said, I think Greg Duncan, working on his work on childhood poverty, of course, that's a whole nother topic because it really is about the environmental and leveling the playing field there. But this part of it too. I mean, attitudes affect behavior, and the attitudes you have in childhood, when they get deeply ingrained, are very hard to change by adulthood. The social psychologists write about this a lot, that stereotypes are deeply entrenched by adulthood and very difficult to change. And so my first line, a lot of my grant applications. So we have to start early and look at how kids think about it. Yeah.
Okay, Luca had the second question. Children from their own observation.
The second question, and let's open it.
Okay, the next question then is by Judy Newman. And she asks, are there connections you might draw regarding children's rights as research participants and issues, timing of assent and consent?
Yeah, what was the about the connection between rights and what?
Rights as research participants and issues and timing of assent and consent, research consent and assent, I assume.
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, we have very extensive IRB protocols. I'm not sure if it's about that. I mean, everything's voluntary and in terms of and we tell kids what we're doing. And I mean, the thing I like about our research is doesn't involve deception and a lot of things that some of the other studies do in this field, or things like the dictator game, ultimatum game, which have their role. There's a place there, but I think that this is really just asking kids about what happens in their world. And how they
Melanie, I wasn't suggesting, it wasn't about the actual research protocols for your studies. It was that as researchers, might your understanding of children's understanding of rights have some connection to the whole children's rights issue regarding their own participation in research studies, not your study particularly. I wasn't questioning that.
Yes, I see. Well, definitely. I mean, Martin Ruck has done, and Charles Helwig, he's here somewhere. They've done a lot of really important work on children's rights, and a lot of that is related to, say, the UN. Where's Charles? The UN. What is it? The rights of the child. But we're actually, that's right now, Martin Ruck and I are writing an article with Laura Ellenboss on connecting rights and inequalities, and because that is another connection that's really important, and how kids think about their rights to nurturance, rights for self-determination, and a lot of the work Charles has done in China, it's nice because it's cross-cultural, and so I think that's a really important connection, and there's a lot there. That's a whole line of research that we're not doing exactly, but certainly we're integrating some of that, because if you're social inequalities are denying children's rights, and so how do kids think about those rights, and what do they think about it? Again, it's the child's perspective, and very, very important. So it's a great question.
Okay, there's a question by Matthew Stapleton, and I read it. What are the proposed mechanisms for change in the intervention study? And do you have plans to manipulate those in future studies in alternative control groups?
Oh, great question too. Thank you. These questions are all great. It's really fun. I mean, the mechanism of change there is really, in a lot of ways, it really is the discussions and getting kids to think about these things. So having that opportunity, the classroom discussion. I mean, the tool itself is important. They have 12 responses they make for each scenario, times 8 is 96 responses that they're putting into these scenarios. So we're learning a lot about how kids think about these situations, but it's really the conversation in the classroom. You saw some of those statements that they're making. It's very rich. It's really, there's a lot going on. I would love to just spend all day talking about the things that they say, but that's not the point here. And so, I think that that's an important mechanism. Now, there's a lot more to do. So we did schools that were 60-40, 60% white, 40% ethnic minority. But the issue was there weren't enough robust, there wasn't critical mass of each ethnic minority group. So we weren't really able to say exactly what, say, Asian kids got out of Black kids or Latinx and so forth. So we have another study planned this fall, and we're actually in schools after a year of not being able to look at schools where there's no numeric majority. And that I think will be really interesting when you're in a school with no numeric majority. And we have, where we live, fortunately, Maryland, we have access to a lot of schools that are 30, 30, 30, and they're that same SES, so we don't have that as confound, and we're going to go back in with a lot of revised measures and updated measures and look at that. But the other thing is we're going to look at more systematically and quantitatively the classroom discussions and things that kids saying, and also the teacher. We have a pre-test, post-test measure for teachers, because what are teachers learning from this? Our focus groups were amazing, and a lot of the things things teachers said were things like, wow, I heard things about my kids I never knew they experienced. Or we got the teachers said things like, my kids are clueless. I found out they really just don't know about some of these things. So we changed our pre-test, post-test measure because we had one about colorblind. That didn't really work. So all the teachers said they were not. Okay. But now we have this measure that's sort of like, did you learn, what do kids, are you comfortable talking about race in the classroom, or what are things you've learned about your kids, or, more that are sort of about their actual experience. But so, yeah, the proposed mechanism for change, I would actually say it's a premature question for us, because I think we still have to do a lot more research, because we've just been in, certain types of schools and we have certain types of measures. I think we would probably stay with our business as usual control group. You could have a control group where they watch a video about whales and dolphins and discuss that. But, these schools are taxed. They're very busy. They're inundated. There's a ton of things going on. So the business as usual will probably stay with that as our control group.
Okay. The next question is by Franklin Moreno. And for the last study presented, how long after the last intervention were changes in attitudes assessed? Is there follow-up to assess lasting effects?
Yeah, excellent question.
Wonderful presentation.
Pardon?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming. Yeah, it's 1 week after. 1 week is our post-test. And so now we have to, do the follow-up of, maybe a 3-month follow-up post-test. So there's more to do here, and that's important. And we also have controlled teachers who want to do the program because, they were aware of it. But what we actually have a lot of teachers around the country who sort of asked us about this. They wrote this article in the American Educator, and I had no idea that it went to a lot of teachers. I thought it was more local in DC, but it wasn't. And so teachers from around the country are saying, we'd like to do it. And we've just told them we need to finish this evaluation of it because we're still modifying and changing it. And so we've got teachers, they're asked to do these programs and nobody's evaluated them first. So we're gonna do that. So yes, very good question about how long do the change in attitudes last, and we'll be doing follow-ups for that.
Okay, the next question is by Cynthia Lightfoot. What sort of differences in knowing, thinking about justice and equality would you expect between children growing up in highly variable, racially, economically contexts compared to those growing up in less diverse contexts?
Yeah, excellent question, and exactly what we really want to do, because we're in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., and so we have a whole range from high affluent all-white schools to low-income minority schools to a number of schools that are mixed ethnicity and middle to low middle income. And those have been primarily the schools we're in. We're not looking at the extremes, but I always say, we've got to do this study in Idaho. And I mean, I pick places I probably shouldn't, maybe it's more diverse there than I realize, but, you have to be careful where you say it, but there's obviously a lot of other places to do it. The interesting thing is that we're sort of struggling with is we're evaluating its effectiveness. So right now we're very involved with, weekly feedback to teachers and checking in with them and all that. And if we just take this program and give it to schools, we're just not ready to do that because we really have to think about what do we give them to have to be able to do it. And so that it's going to be a little while. I mean, I wish it was like 20 years younger because it's just going to be a little while. Fortunately, I have a fantastic team of much younger people. So, there's a lot to do for something like this.
Okay. The next question is by Maria Varelas. Might there be a relation between the children's sense of agency for being able to change the situation and their views on social hierarchies and equality?
That's really interesting. Maria, can you tell me a little about what you mean by children's sense of agency? I like that. What do you mean?
Sure. Thank you for the presentation, first of all. Intriguing findings. I wonder really when we think about their sense of act, of being able to change society or their group dynamics, whether they have a sense of being able to overcome peer pressure, right? So that's what I mean by agency, the ability to act and their act to bring about the change, and whether that might affect some ways the conceptions that they're developing about what's equality or the presence of social hierarchy.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's very Piagetian, right? Because that really is from Piaget's book, that autonomy is agency in many ways. I think that there definitely is a relationship there. It's hard because it's hard to figure out, what's your measure of agency. That's a hard thing. I'm not sure it's really, I don't know, I have to think about that a little bit more. But I think part of what we're doing, which is why I'm sort of amazed we're even given funding to do this study, because it's not like we're sort of creating agency as we're measuring it. So when the kids are in these classrooms and discussing things, there's agency coming through, because the kids are saying, they told me I couldn't play with them. We had one situation, the girl said, they didn't let me play because I'm a girl at soccer. And then they talked, and the girl said, well, the boy said, well, we didn't know you wanted to play. You should have told us. And then the girl next to her said, well, that happened to me, but they said I couldn't play because of my skin color. The kids sort of went, and they sort of listened. And then the first girl leaned over and rubbed her back and said, that's not nice. And we have to think about that. She didn't say we have to think about that. She just said, that's not nice. But I mean, in the classroom got into discussion about that. So there's sort of a sense of agency, because I don't think either of these girls would have said this on the playground. I mean, I just don't think that would be very feasible. And so here is supposed to be a safe space where they're able to do this. So it does involve a lot of the teacher training. I'm always thinking about Larry Nucci when I say that. But there's a lot has to be on the teacher part of it and teacher training, which, to be honest, I haven't focused on so much in my career because I'm so focused on peer relations and how kids are their social cognitive development. But yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think it's very much related. There's a very strong relationship. It'll come out as we go. We'll learn more and we'll come back to it and think about it.
Then next question, may I ask Elizabeth Cavici to ask it directly? Elizabeth Cavici.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. In your intervention study, could you go on? I know you just kind of started to answer my question, but could you describe further the ways that the teacher-mediated discussions of the children in the classroom, their responses to the scenarios and their own personal experiences, how these develop relationships among the classmates, children classmates, and the teacher in new ways, and with their awareness of inequality, inequity, and injustice as they experience it personally, as their classmates experience it, and in the world around them?
That's an excellent question, and really, really important. It turned out it was a lot of work. Initially, teachers want to disseminate. They think of their role as dissemination. And we had a lot of discussions about this because we found out in the very beginning, even though we had a teacher training workshop, we talked about facilitating. You're a facilitator. You don't need to be teaching. You don't even have to watch the scenarios. We had a few teachers start out, okay, everybody, today we learned that exclusion is wrong. I want to tell you about something that happened to me and I did this and whatever. And she had a little anecdote about herself and she was excluded for something that didn't seem that relevant to those of us. I think Alex was there and I were observing. It's like, what's she talking about? And so we realized we had to, have a lot more discussions with teachers about what it means to facilitate. And we created those charts, we elaborated them. In the beginning we had, I'm sure some of you can appreciate this problem, we had an 18-page manual for teachers. And the teacher focus group said, forget it. You need a one-page one each week. Okay, we get that. And so, it was really a lot of work. So the teacher mediated discussions, there is training. It's not natural for them. The counselors told us they think about dissemination. And I said, well, even what about, they said, they do math and reading. I said, but even math and reading, shouldn't that be interactive? So, but that's how there's a lot of work here, but some of the teachers were amazing at this and really good and so sensitive and really understood it. So, they were quite amazing. So I don't have an easy answer. How did they do it? It's a process. It's important.
Next question is by Rebecca Ruger. She says, wonderful presentation. When you discuss the study where students with low SES tend to believe that individual mechanisms cause it, I was wondering whether or not this locus of control would transfer to other areas in their lives?
Well, yeah, that's a little bit outside of my sort of expertise, but what I know, I know Bill Arsenio and Connie Flanagan have done a lot more of this work, but if the students with low SES, so they think that individual mechanisms are the one. So you're asking whether this transfers to other aspects. It probably does, in that they're thinking it is about individual effort. But I think a lot of it also is that we've had this happen when we've been interviewing low-income minority adolescents, is they don't like the idea that there are these structural obstacles. You know, we've had adolescents say things to us like, we've talked about even prejudice. They say, I don't really want to talk about it. It's depressing. My mom, she marched with Martin Luther King. So that was good. They made change. I want to get a job, or I want to, do this or that. I mean, I think it's kind of overwhelming for them. So sometimes maybe they're focused on this notion that it is about how hard you work. But the problem is that when they go out there and we find this happen when you're interviewing actually college level age minority individuals, which we've done in a number of these different studies, then they'll say, like, I used to think it was about individual effort, and I found out no matter how hard I work or how hard I try, it's not going to happen. So that's the health crisis that can happen there. So does it transfer? I hope it does. I don't know. And I don't really do that research. But I think it's an important issue. I have to say it's counterintuitive. I just sort of thought that the low-income kids would be the ones to, for that study, to be the ones to focus on structural and high-income on individual, but it really wasn't like that. And now I have a better understanding of it by reading more of the literature.
The next question is by Saba Ayman Noli. Sorry if I butchered the name. Wonderful presentation and great set of studies. Did you measure the exclusive type or of views, attitudes of the teachers, or the ethnicity of the teachers?
Oh, yes. Okay. So what was the first part? The ethnicity of the teachers, but what was the other part?
Did you measure the exclusive type of views, attitudes of the teachers?
Yeah, right. That's an excellent question. We wanted to, and we had, as I said, we had this sort of colorblind bias measure that we did use in this study, and it just didn't really get us what we had hoped it would. It was supposed to sort of get at whether the teachers are starting out with a bias, and we could either control for that, or we could look at it as a variable. But it just didn't really pan out. I mean, we read these responses, like 10 or 20 times, and every time we say, okay, that's our task now, we're going to figure this out. And then we finally realized it's just not really giving us what we need. There's not much variability. So now, as I said, based on teacher focus groups, we've really revised that. But as far as their ethnicity, we need more teachers because we don't have, you take teachers, we have 72 teachers. We're going to do a new study. But also there isn't a lot of variability. I mean, teachers tend to be female and they tend to be white, although there is, I think the teacher ethnicity might have been, minority might have been more like 20 or 30%, something like that. I see Alex shaking his head, yeah. Okay, so it's like 70% white and 30% minority. So it's not really enough when you have just 72 teachers to really look at whether ethnicity of teacher is contributing. But we really do need to do more of that. I don't know if it will. I think, a lot of it does come back to the training, how good these teachers are and their sensitivity. And there's a lot that goes into that. So I don't know. Yeah, but that's important to look at. And certainly it's important to look at what the biases that teachers are going into. We just didn't have a good measure of it. So we're going to try to understand that better.
I hate to do this, but I have to ask now the last question. Because we have to close in a minute to avoid catastrophe. I really appreciate all the questions that have been asked by the attendees. Maybe they can email you, Melanie, with their questions if they have not been addressed during this session. But the last question by Martina Cabra is, when you speak about children's understandings, you're talking about a certain form of knowledge which can be verbalized and communicated. And you mentioned how these understandings established in childhood might affect behavior and be difficult to change. Have you looked at, or do you have some ideas as to the ways in which the children act or behave in relation to these inequalities, hierarchy, etc. in interaction? Does enactment precede understanding?
That's an excellent question and really nicely framed. And the answer is, to some extent, as a constructivist, it's really a back and forth process. It's really interactional, and it's very hard. We've done a lot of this research on judgment and action, which was a big project that Elliot had for a number of years, and really looking at the relationship. And the relationship really is one of interaction and dynamics. And so you try to say, does behavior come first, the judgment, or does judgment come first? I mean, these things are starting in infancy, and it's going back and forth all through childhood, and there's over thousands and thousands of experiences. It's kind of hard to have a control study. Okay, here's the behavior, now it's going to affect this judgment. But you don't know that, like, the day before they had this incredible experience or interaction with somebody else about it. That doesn't mean it's not an important issue. It is. It's just very difficult to look at. When we were doing our exclusion studies, we, at one point we thought we really should just see, like, how often are kids excluding each other in the playground recess. And so this is way back, but we sort of, had people observe, and like we were waiting, and we didn't see that much. And I started realizing, understanding a lot of it's covert. You're not going to see it, this exclusion, you're not going to see it on the playground. It's not like waiting for we were in the judgment action study we did, Elliot led up, we were doing like waiting for transgression, which is like a conflict. Somebody hit somebody else and they got mad and things like that. The exclusion is more covert, and you don't always see it, and they're not stating it explicitly. And Carol Martin confirmed this when she was doing gender stereotypes. She said, yeah, I tried to, we tried to watch this happen, and it was really, it's hard to document. So it's a very important question, but it's a complicated one. I do think that, I don't want to just say like, I think it is, and that's why it is, but I think the theories, suggest that there's a lot of back and forth. And we did have kids in these actual discussions in the intervention study, talk about this, and I would just love to see if, like, did the boys actually include the girls at soccer the next day? Because they stated publicly in the classroom, if I knew you wanted to play, would have asked you to play. And you just feel like there's some kind of accountability that might have happened there. And, I would have liked to see. And so maybe there's a way that we can do that after some of these conversations. But we'd have to, like, I don't know, surreptitiously disguise ourselves. Hey, those are the people who were in our classroom. So, yeah. So thank you for that question, though. It's very thoughtful and really important to think about.
Okay. Thank you very much, Melanie, for the stimulating, thought-provoking presentation. Thank you for the questions, and I hope to see you at other sessions today.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful questions. Thank you for coming.